Well, good morning, everyone. Let me just start by saying, really delighted to have this opportunity to come and open the conference today, and also to speak once again in this lecture theatre. I was here a couple of years ago, giving a talk on the flipped or the inverted classroom, and it wasn't until after I'd flown in yesterday that I actually looked at the map to try and figure out where I'd be going and thought, oh yeah, it's actually in the same place as I was before. So my talk today is going to be about technology in student learning. But more important than the technology, it's going to be about pedagogy and getting the pedagogy and the technology the right way round. And it's really going to comprise two parts. I want to preface the main body of my talk with some opening remarks about the landscape or the state of technology enhanced, both to sort of frame my own presentation, but also, I hope, as a lead into the discussions that we'll be having later on today. I'm going to be able to stay for all the talks today. I fly out tomorrow, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing about some of the things that have been going on here in Birmingham. So let me start, though, with something disruptive. This, if you like, this graphic, this map, is a map of the inputs going into what you might think of as an ecosystem around online content and online learning. And, you know, there are universities there, just as there's always been, but there's new interests as well from companies and also venture capitalists who are funding an awful lot of this. And although online content's been around for quite some time, there's nothing new in the idea. I think what's really different now is just how rapidly this is all moving and how rapidly it's developing. Essentially, in the last few years, since Stanford offered the first of these things that have now become known as MOOCs, massively open online courses, or at least the first of the new generation of MOOCs, because the original idea goes back quite a bit further. We're now in a state or an age or an environment where content is essentially digital, open, and free or low cost at the point of delivery. And so these are very rapid changes, and they're also changes that are prompting conversations, at least in my university and probably here as well, about things much bigger than just online content. It's prompting conversations around the conventions associated with higher education, the purpose of a higher education institution, the value add that we actually bring to students by getting them into physical classroom spaces like this one, the role of the instructor or the academic in teaching and learning. These are really, really big questions. So in a few years, we've come to the point where content is digital, open, and now being capable of delivery at scale. UBC is one of the institutions that's partnered with Coursera to offer a small number of these massive open online courses. And in the last 12 months, over 4 million students have signed up for these courses offered across the various platforms. So that's one driver for changes in the learning environment. Another driver comes from students as well. And I should say, most of the data sources that I'm going to use in this first part of the course, it's in a lecture theatre, you see, I just go into lecture mode. The first part of the talk are from North American sources. This one is from a student survey administered annually through EDUCAUSE. The latest 2012 survey captured the views of over 100,000 students about how they use technology in their learning. All these slides will be available afterwards, so don't worry about copying down citations. The last slide will have a link where you can actually get the slides themselves. So although the data sources are North American, I think the picture that they paint is very transferable. And reflecting on my own experience here in the UK before I moved to Vancouver, many of these things coming out of US data sources or surveys still hold true. So if the learning technology landscape is one driver, student views and student preferences are another driver. And you can see on this slide, nearly 3/4 of students say they learn more in blended learning environments. Students say they're more actively involved in courses that incorporate technology. More than half of them claim that. It's all very well looking at student perceptions. What about the research data? Is there any research evidence for the effectiveness of blended or online learning? And it's very easy to pick individual papers in a statistics module or a language learning course. I think one of the most compelling sources that I've found recently is this US Department of Education meta-analysis. So the same sorts of things they do in the medical sciences, looking at clinical trials. This is a meta-analysis of over 1,000 research studies looking into the efficacy of online and blended learning compared to face-to-face learning. It's a few years old. It was published in 2009, but it looked at these studies over the preceding decade and was actually quite stringent in terms of the requirements for inclusion in the study. So they had to have a rigorous research design, measure learning outcomes compared to face-to-face teaching, and either calculate effect size or present enough data for effect sizes to be able to be calculated. And what they found on average is that students did indeed perform better in online learning situations. And the optimal configuration where this learning was maximized was in a blended environment, where the online component is married with a face-to-face interaction as well. You have to be slightly careful because sometimes you're not always comparing apples with apples, and they referred to this in the study, because quite often in the online situation or courses with a substantial online component, it's not about the media per se, because what it actually does is it affords different or more efficient or more effective modes of interaction between students and instructors. So it's not about the introduction of technology per se, it's how that technology is put to use in service of the educational aims of what you're trying to do. And that really is the theme that I'm trying to weave throughout the whole of this talk. There's also growing evidence amongst academic leadership about the efficacy and effectiveness of online learning. So what this slide is showing is over a 10-year period, it's the academic leaders' perceptions of learning in the online environment compared to a traditional face-to-face. And you can see, looking at the blue percentages, that it's heading steadily upwards over this decade period. So we're at the point where about 77%, 3/4 of academic leadership across US institutions that contributed to the survey believe that learning outcomes in the blended environment are at least as effective or at least as effectively achieved as in the face-to-face environment. Interesting contrast is if you look at essentially the same question asked of academic staff or of faculty over approximately the same 10-year period, looking at the acceptance of the value and validity, or if you like, legitimacy of online education. Over that 10-year period, looking at academic staff, it's basically flat. So there's a disconnect here between both what the research is saying, what academic leaders are thinking, and what people are actually reporting at the coalface, as it were. And let me just jump back to students again, because they, in all of this, should be front and center. And a few slides ago, I was saying about how students' perceptions of online learning point to the fact that they find it more effective. There's also more of them doing it. In the last 4 years, the percentage of students taking at least one fully online course as part of their program, so this is a credit-bearing course as part of their program, has doubled in 4 years. And that percentage is now more or less 1/3 of students at the US institutions that contributed to this. So the last few slides might leave you feeling a little bit uneasy, especially for first thing on a Monday morning. But I want to close off this section with what I think is some really positive news. And as part of this student survey that I mentioned earlier, students were asked to report what modes of communication, what tools they wish their instructors would use more of in communicating with them. And it was a, check all the boxes that apply. And two things came out top of the pile, coincidentally with 53% of all students choosing this. Anyone want to hazard a guess at what might be behind my blacked out slide? This is where the people at the front get very, very nervous now. You know how your students feel now, don't you? Anyone want to have a guess? Just shout out. Email? Yep. Any others? Sorry? Phone? Face-to-face. Isn't that a bit old-fashioned? Anything else? Online fora and video. Face-to-face, very good. I take this as actually quite positive. So the VLE is there, or Learning Management System, as I now have to call it, working in North America. But also face-to-face interaction. This, for me, is really, really encouraging because this is student-reported data. This, to me, says they get it. They want the convenience of online and blended, but they also understand that learning at its heart is a social process. And so interaction between the people, whether face-to-face or mediated in an online environment, is really the difference between information, which can be accessed in a variety of different ways, and understanding or learning. And I'll just take a small sideways step to tell you a little bit about my context at UBC. So in the year that I've been there, we've sort of mobilized ourselves to meet these challenges head on in quite a big way through an initiative that has been launched that we're calling Flexible Learning. Flexible Learning has some extremely ambitious targets for it. In terms of undergraduate education, this initiative wants to transform the way 25% of undergraduate courses are taught in 5 years. Now, UBC is a big institution. We have 50,000 undergraduate students. This is an enormous scale project. And for someone like myself, my current role, I'm a faculty member in the Department of Physics and Astronomy, but I'm also seconded to the Provost's office to support teaching and learning and direct our teaching and learning centre. That centre is currently working on 118 different course transformations. So we live in exciting times. There's also other aspects of flexible learning as well about experimentation in disruptive environments like MOOCs and community and lifelong learning. But the undergraduate transformation really is at the heart of what we're trying to do. And it's going to be a big focus for us over the next few years. Okay, so that's the sort of 30,000 feet view, if you like. Let me come right back down to ground level now and give you a sort of at the coalface example of what this looks like in a teaching and learning context. So I'm going to talk about how we've integrated a freely available online tool called Peerwise, developed at the University of Auckland in New Zealand, into the teaching and the assessment of a large enrollment undergraduate physics course. Just before I tell you about Peerwise and what we've done with it, I want to start by telling you the motivation for why I started using it a few years before I left Edinburgh. So the case study that I'm going to present for you spans 3 or 4 years. And the original motivation was that we had a problem, or at least we thought we had a problem. So as any good scientist will tell you, you form a hypothesis, you go out and collect some data and you analyze it to either support or refute that hypothesis. Oh, the other thing I should say, actually, just before moving on, Little bit of a health warning for a Monday morning. So this talk does have physics in it. This might be quite traumatic for some of you, but I make no apologies for it because it's my disciplinary background. It's the context with which I'm most familiar. But if you're sort of beginning to turn off, thinking, oh, physics, not again, what I would say in defense is the online community of practice that we have built to support people using this peer-wise system at institutions all over the world has membership from academic communities as diverse as music to mathematics, history to health sciences, and everything in between. So what I'm about to talk to you about, though grounded in physics and most of the data I'll show you comes from the sciences, it's eminently transferable to other disciplines. So back to my problem. The problem, as I perceived it, was this. I was teaching a large. I've had to recalibrate my sense of large since moving to North America in so many ways. Cars being one of them, actually. Can't believe, you know, this is not the first time I've come back, but I can't believe how small the cars are here. Anyway, I was teaching a large physics course in Edinburgh, about 300 students enrollment. And I was concerned that many of them were not spending anywhere near enough time on self-study outside the classroom. So, you know, lecture attendance was pretty good. We had these interactive lectures with clickers and things like that. But I was concerned that not enough of them were doing the requisite work outside class that we expected of them. So I decided to collect some data using clickers, using the electronic voting system. And I asked them this question. And because they were from different degree backgrounds, I didn't focus on a specific course, but, you know, again, shows the physicist in me. I introduced a variable where n is the number of contact hours you have in a week. How much time do you do in self-study? Anyone want to predict what they think this graph should look like? Yeah.
Most of them didn't do any.
No. Oh, sorry to interrupt you. What do you think it should look like? You get a chance to tell me what you think the students said in a minute.
I would have thought they would study twice the number of contact hours at least.
Yeah. Okay. So the response here was around about twice the number of contact hours. That's pretty much what I thought too, doing the numbers for contact hours and credit points and things like that. This is a first-year course in the Scottish system, so many of them were coming in with A-levels. So I was expecting something roughly normal centered on n, right? That is not what I found. Ignore the yellow and the red data. The blue data is the first-year students. And, you know, I know there's the caveat about it's self-reported data, and there could be an element of bravado coming over from high school that it's just not cool to say that you do any work at all. But nonetheless, nearly a third of the students were declaring that they were doing essentially no work outside class. And some 75% were, in my view, doing too little. I won't show you the data, but I then went on to ask them, how much do you think? How much time do you think you should be putting in outside class time? That was normally distributed around n. So this was very interesting. This was in about week 4 of these first-year students' university degrees. So somehow in 4 weeks, they'd absorbed what they should be doing, but they weren't doing it. So this is how we started first using this system. We were looking for a way to engage students in meaningful, out-of-class, in their own time, productive study. And we found out about this system. As I say, it's developed by Paul Denny, computer scientist at the University of Auckland, and essentially, it's a web-based system, freely available online through any device, works with your tablet or your laptop, in which students in a cohort can develop multiple choice questions associated with the content on their courses. They can then submit this into a repository and answer and discuss questions written by their peers. It incorporates a lot of social functionality, so it feels much more like many of the websites students spend their time on, sometimes spend their time on in lecture theatres like this, than institutional VLEs or other institutional software. So it has things like, if I like the questions that someone is authoring, I can follow them. as an author. And every time they post a new question, I get a little message when I log in to say that my favorite authors have posted new questions, or there's new comments about discussions that I'm involved in. I can upvote comments and things like that. So it has a high degree of social interaction built into it. Just some numbers for you. It was first developed about 2007 and is now used across, somewhere higher than 300 institutions. Over 100,000 unique student IDs and unique student contributors. 500,000 student questions and over 10 million student answers. And I should emphasize, when you log in, you only see the environment associated with your course. So you don't see this enormous pile of 500,000 questions. But aggregated across all the courses and all the disciplines that this has been used in, there's 500,000 questions been developed. And in the next few slides, rather than attempt a live demonstration, which I've had spectacular failures with in the past, not because of the system, but just the vagaries of technology and accessing the web in an unfamiliar theatre. I've just got a few snapshots of the screens that will step you through the process of what it looks and feels like as a question authorer. So you're in the shoes of students at the moment, and then after you've authored a question, answering a question. So this is what the interface looks like. It's a pretty straightforward word processing interface. Crucially, for my own discipline, there's the capability to easily input mathematics. You can't really do physics, even introductory physics, without the capability to do this and to do it easily. Because if it annoys students, or the Java applet crashes their browser, or it doesn't work, this is a huge barrier to students actually using it, much more than you think. You can put HTML in, you can put pictures in, so chemical structures. You can even put video clips in if you want to, embedded within the question. Students then have to provide answer choices, select which one of them is correct. You can have as many as they like, and again, the editing interface is exactly the same, so you can have pictures or equations or formulae in the answer choices. Crucially, they then have to provide an explanation. Why the answer is what the answer is, and why the other choices that they've chosen are incorrect. They can then tag the question to make it discoverable or easy to find, because you can imagine when you start getting hundreds of questions or thousands, how do you as a student going in there find questions that you're interested in? You can either seed the tags with topics relevant to the course, or you can let students choose their own. I did the latter, which is why you get tags including beer, science fiction, and all sorts of things like that. So explanation topics, you then submit it into the repository. And then you can go and browse the repository for what other people have put there, and this is the kind of interface that you see. You can sort the questions chronologically, you can sort them by the number of comments or the difficulty rating or the overall difficulty. You can also interrogate a tag cloud of the keywords. So the idea is it doesn't particularly show up very well here, but the idea is that the more frequently a tag is used, the bigger the word becomes. So if you wanted to, you could just go and practice questions on a certain topic, and clicking each of these words, which is a hyperlink, will take you to questions, a bundle of questions that have just that tag associated with them. So let's say you pick a question and you choose to do it. The first thing you see is you get some basic statistical information on the question itself, how many people have answered it, what the quality rating is, that sort of thing. You get the question. It's sort of cut off because it's multi-screen, so I'm just grabbing one screen at a time. You get the answer alternatives there. Let's say you choose one of them, choose C. You're immediately told that that's the right answer by the green box. You also get to see the distribution of responses of other students that have answered this question. And once you've answered it, you get access to the explanation that the author of the question has developed. And it goes down here. Now, if you're stuck, you have a couple of options. You can request help from the author, so that the next time the author logs in, there's a little message that says, so-and-so student has requested help with your question on this kind of thing. If you think you can improve it, you can also collaborate with the question author to collectively come up with a better explanation for what's going on here. The final thing that you're asked to do is to rate the questions on a fairly coarse-grained scale for difficulty and for quality. And I'm not going to talk too much about student views of what makes a quality question because it's very, very subjective, right? But it provides a way for other students to sort or to look for questions that they might be interested in. And then there's comments and discussions embedded within the question. So you don't have to go somewhere separate to a discussion board to talk about this question. It's interleaved with the question itself. And a little bit later on in the talk, I'll show you some examples of the work that students have produced using this system. In terms of a timeline, this is roughly how it looks chronologically. In 2010, we did a pilot study at the University of Edinburgh. The following year, we got this grant from JISC that you heard about in the introduction to do essentially a multi-institution, multi-course replication study of the same thing, of embedding it into undergraduate courses. Moving to UBC, I've used it in this non-majors course. And also, interestingly, we've trialed it in one of these MOOCs that we're offering in partnership with Coursera. So a very different way to deploy this. And the data that I'm presenting will be from somewhere along this timeline, mainly from the UBC course, but with other data, particularly from this multi-institution study in there as well. I'll tell you a little bit about the research that we've done around effectiveness for encouraging student learning. So what we have found, and I'll show you examples of this shortly, is good engagement and participation beyond what we set as the minimum assessment requirements for using this system. But we also found a correlation between the amount students use this system and their end-of-course exam marks. Now, I'll stress the word correlation there. I'm not claiming causation. And what you might be tempted to say, if I say that there's a correlation, you might just think, oh, well, it's the best students, because they'll do well at anything you throw at them. This is the fraction of the cohort that you believe would still come out with a very good mark on the course if you shut them in the broom cupboard with nothing but a textbook. So we tried to find a way to unpack that and see if it really was benefiting the top end of students preferentially, because what we want to try and do is benefit all students if we can. And how we did it was we found a way of splitting students into quartiles of ability the very first day that they walked through the door for our course. In physics, there's a number of validated diagnostic test instruments that we've used for a number of years. The particular one for this course is something called the Force Concept Inventory. And we've routinely delivered this at the start of the course and at the end of the course, this pre-post testing methodology that allows you to see, it's the same instrument delivered at the start and at the end, and it allows you to see how student learning improves over the duration of the course. It's also a direct, if you like, externally validated measure of your teaching effectiveness in a way, because you're really looking at student learning gains. So we had this data from the very first day of the course, and it allowed us to split students into ability quartiles based on the score that they got with this diagnostic test. And having those 4 ability quartiles, what we then did was the students in those quartiles, we split them into 2 groups based on how much they used the peerwise system. It's just a simple median split. Students are either in a group that used the system more than the median activity or less than the median activity. And what's shown on this graph here is, it's chopped off the bottom, but these are quartiles 1, 2, 3, and 4, according to this diagnostic test split. And it's the correlation with the mean exam mark at the end of the course. And what you find is for the students in the high peerwise activity group, consistently, they are getting higher exam scores than those in the lower peerwise activity group. The error bars here are the standard error on the mean, and in some cases, in this group and this group, these are statistically significant differences with moderate effect sizes. Okay, so 1 year, 1 course, 1 set of instructors, 1 data point. The multi-institution study that we did took to try and reevaluate this or replicate this in different institutional and disciplinary contexts. So this is the Edinburgh data. Again, we also had second-year physics data from the University of Glasgow. Same kind of thing. The way the quartile split was done was slightly different because these weren't all the same courses, so you couldn't use exactly the same diagnostic test. But broadly, this initial split into ability correlated with the end-of-course exam mark, showed the same thing. Second-year biology at the University of Edinburgh. First-year chemistry at Edinburgh. First-year chemistry at the University of Nottingham. So there's something very consistent going on here. And we think this is fairly compelling evidence of this correlation. I'll stress again, we're not trying to prove causation. In principle, you can't do it because there's too many other confounding influences and variables. But a very, very strong signal here that this is possibly in different ways beneficial to students' learning. The other thing that we did was we wanted to have a look at just how good the questions were that students created. I'll show you some examples in a few slides' time, but you could accuse me of just cherry-picking the best examples. What we wanted to do is to look across a representative sample to really get a sense of what the whole repository or the whole bundle of questions were like. And so what we did, and this was a couple of really excellent undergraduate project students in the last year that I was at Edinburgh, was we mapped the questions onto the levels in the cognitive domain of Bloom's taxonomy. So if you're not familiar with Bloom's taxonomy, the basic structure is you have the sort of low-level tasks at the bottom, remembering things, understanding, moving up towards higher-level cognitive skills of analysis and synthesis and evaluation. And their projects were to look at a representative sample. I think we got just over 50% of the questions authored over a couple of courses and over a couple of years, so about 600 questions in all, and to map the questions onto these various levels. And we did the usual tests for inter-rater reliability and that sort of thing, because classifying is an inherently subjective process as well. And this is what they found. In some cases, as low as 5% of the questions were targeting factual recall or basic memorization. This is remarkable for first-year students in an undergraduate program, that they are capable of producing questions of very high mean quality, and in some cases at the top end, we can argue whether it's a 4 or a 5 or a 6, whether it's analyzing, evaluating, or synthesis, but it's certainly not just remembering or understanding. So the results of both these two investigations, if you like, are currently being reviewed, and the details of the papers are in the slides towards the end. Let me tell you about how we implemented it in the UBC physics course. As you heard in the introduction, this is one of these mind-bogglingly huge courses at North American institutions. If you're trying to imagine what the lecture theatre looks like, then don't. We split them into sections of about 250 or 300 students. But essentially, they run every semester multiple sections with a huge array of instructors and TAs supporting them. And the 3 sections that were running in the winter term, so January to April this year, were in total about 800 students. The interesting thing is not one of them wants to be a physicist. They're all non-majors. They all have to do this course because their program requires 3 credits of physics for them to graduate, or they need it to go into med school or dental school or something else that they want to do subsequently. But they're non-majors. It's a very, very different cohort than previously I'd been used to teaching. And the way we implemented it was we built 2 assessment activities into the summative assessment of the course. So these were 2 peer-wise assignments. And we didn't just say to the students, here's this system, it will be really good for you, go and use it and do these questions. We spent a lot of time, class time, scaffolding their understanding and their use of the system. What we didn't do was we didn't give them tutorials in how to log on or how to write a question or anything like that, because they know how to do this stuff. We spent the time with the scaffolding activities thinking about what makes a good multiple choice question. How do you write about not what you currently know, but something that's just beyond the level of your current understanding? And then what we did do was subsequently, every 2 weeks when we had a tutorial, we wove in student-generated questions, either for sort of practice discussion in groups to get the tutorial going, clicker questions for assessment. We put student questions on the examinations, on the midterm, and on the final exam. So it was really something that was woven into the fabric of the course all the way through. What we asked them to do for each assessment was we had minimum participation requirements which would gain them most of the assessment credit. There was a small bonus for performance, but essentially most of the assessment credit was for satisfying minimum participation requirements, which were write one question, answer at least 5 others, so write at least one, answer 5 others, rate and comment on 3 further ones. And each of these assessments contributed 2.5%. So in total, we're talking about a 5% contribution to the course assessment. And then we didn't do anything. We were deliberately hands-off in the peer-wise system. And we made it clear to students, this is your space, right? You moderate it. If there's things you see wrong, feel empowered to correct it. This is not somewhere we're going to come in and teach you. But we did observe what was going on. The scaffolding that we did, I mentioned this previously. One of the nice things that we managed to do was we managed to, if you like, incorporate a key concept in educational theory to students without actually telling them what it was. So we got them to think in terms of a zone of proximal development. But the last thing we were going to say to them was, this is all about Vygotsky's zone of proximal development. So we had this graphic that kind of illustrated or represented the process for them. So the green stuff is physics knowledge you've already constructed and you understand. The red stuff is material and knowledge and understanding that's far beyond where you are at the moment. But the blue zone, the Goldilocks zone, if you like, is just in between. And that's where we want students to operate. We want them to elevate themselves beyond what they currently can do and know, operate in this blue zone so that the act of writing a question is in itself a learning opportunity for the author. And again, these scaffolding materials, there's links to them at the end of the talk. They're all freely available for people to download and reuse and modify if they want to. Here's an example of one of the student questions that we brought back into subsequent tutorials. This is a clicker question. It's a pity I didn't bring clickers. I could have got you all to have a vote on it. And again, later on in the semester, before the second peer-wise activity, we kind of gave them a brief mini tutorial about how to raise their game. So how to really think about developing good quality distractors or about good quality explanations. In terms of engagement, the first assessment activity, so we had 664 active students out of 790. I don't have time to go into why that's lower than you might imagine, but there are reasons for it, and we can talk about that later if you're interested. In terms of questions, they wrote, in the space of about 2 weeks, 1,300 questions. Contributed 11,000 answers, 5,000 comments. Now, some of the comments were, great question, dude, and things like that. I still can't quite bring myself to call people dude in North America. And that's okay, but many of them were really discussing on topic and detailed and involved and engaged discussions of the actual material. So depending on how you count it, this is about 2, 17, and 7 times the minimum requirement. So, pretty strong quantitative evidence for participation beyond the minimum requirements. That's what engagement looks like. That's about 1/4 of the questions submitted in that first assessment exercise. Each one of these numbers is a unique question ID. This is the administrator's view. You don't get to see this if you're a student. But essentially, behind every one of those numbers is a question, an explanation, and in many, many cases, a discussion between question authorer and a number of answerers about why the question is the way it is. Here's another take on engagement. What this is plotting is it's a histogram of the score within the system. The system has kind of gaming elements built into it. So it has a badging system, and this really does motivate some students. It also has a scoring algorithm built in, which is a kind of complicated mathematical formula, but basically gives people points or credit for their contributions and how their contributions are valued by the community. So if you're seen as, a helpful person, your score will go up. If people like your comments, appreciate your explanations, this increases your score. The first red arrow here is the point where the minimum, or the score corresponding to students who satisfied the minimum participation requirements. So everyone to the right of this arrow satisfied the minimum requirements. I said there was a small bonus for performance. That's indicated by this arrow. Everyone to the right of this arrow got full marks on the assessment. So everyone above here got 80%, everyone above here got 100%. So again, another way of looking at the engagement. Let me show you some examples just before I finish. This used to be my favorite question. I've got a new favorite question authored by one of the UBC students. This used to be my favorite question, aside from it being a fantastic diagram that still makes me smile several years after seeing it for the first time. It's actually a really nice example of peer learning in action. Because what happened with this question is the student who authored it got it wrong in their explanation. They actually thought the correct answer was D. And within a couple of hours, the discussions had unfolded, and another student said, no, I think you've got this wrong. And I'm resisting the temptation to go into full-blown physics lecture mode in here and give you a short tutorial on why D is the wrong answer. But they developed a new question and a refined explanation, submitted it back into the system, all within the space of one evening. And the postscript really is the students who answered it subsequently, the original author's incorrect answer turned out to be the most frequently chosen response. So this student had inadvertently highlighted one of the classic misconceptions around this particular topic area. And it's just a great example of peer learning in action. Here's another one. Strange context for them. It gives you a rather worrying insight into what goes on in the minds of undergraduate physics students. This is it's actually a series of questions about penguins in top hats. It's actually thinly disguised or thinly contextualized mechanics problems. But again, this is so we do the 2 or the 3 block case of this in class, but this is a student extending that to a 4 block case. They've got lots of diagrams in there. They've gone through the full mathematical treatment, and it's got 4 blocks, so it's really, really complicated. They've gone all the way down. They've got to the end before putting numbers in, which is just wonderful to see. And then this is discussion between this student and others that answered it. This student saying, I couldn't figure out how to do this, but it has to be this or this. I think you're wrong. And the author coming back saying, no, you're correct. No, I'm correct. Have a look at this diagram, which should clear it up for you. So really rich discussion and interaction. Here's a question from a UBC student. We don't give them any training or any advice on how to produce pictures. Some of them draw things like this. Some of them put notes on a bit of paper and photograph it with their mobile phones. I nearly said cell phone there. Nice question, really rich, really involved. What's particularly striking about this is it marries concepts taught about 4 weeks apart in the course. So there's buoyancy in there, but there's also materials properties. Week 2, week 6, and this is a student synthesizing them together into a single compound question with a range of answers, and plausible answers as well. It's very easy in problems of this type to make a mistake with a factor of 10. right? So you see answers of 3675 and 36750 and a good spread of answers. And again, this is the explanation from this student. Again, very detailed, really, really helpful to another student that doesn't understand the problem quite so well. And discussions as well, good discussions and explanations. You get a lot of this kind of comment as well. You deserve a big fat star. I don't mind that. I don't mind them actually showing that they're enjoying what they're doing. Some people might say, oh, it's not very professional or academic. No, but they're engaged and they're learning. I'm going to close now, so it's a pity that the microphone didn't last just 2 more minutes so I could get to the end. Rather than the conclusion slide of here's what we found and half a dozen bullet points, I want to leave you with a question, which I think it's appropriate to ask of any teaching and learning intervention that we do and we think is effective, and that is, why is it effective? Why does this work? And rather than leave it hanging, that's really tempting to set your homework. Rather than leave it hanging, I'll try and offer an answer in the form of 2 books that I've been reading recently, both of which I'm finding are having a really profound effect on the way I think about my teaching going forward. Here's the first one. It's by Alan November, and it's called Who Owns the Learning? And it makes the case that in a 21st century digital, hyper-connected world, the world in which our students live and learn, they need to own more of the learning. The ownership needs to find a way to be transferred to them. And I think partly that's what this intervention using Peerwise does. Give students freedom and flexibility to write questions about what they're interested in or what they don't understand, and to choose questions to answer, and how and when and with whom to participate in these discussions. The other one is a remarkable book called How Learning Works. It comes out of Carnegie Mellon University, the Teaching and Learning Center there. And what I think is so remarkable about this is it manages to bridge the science of learning, with 20 years of accumulated evidence from brain research and cognitive psychology and educational theory, with evidence-based classroom practices. And it joins both of those two somewhere in the middle. And it actually encapsulates this in 7 principles, which I don't have time to go into in this talk, but you can sum them up in a few sentences. What we've tried to do is actually sum them up in just 1 word. And you'll have to trust me on this, but this activity using Peerwise hits almost every single one of those to a greater or lesser extent. So if you think of this as a framework for understanding how effective learning takes place, and therefore the implications for teaching practice, it hits nearly all of those targets. And so in closing, I think it's fitting that we finish talking about learning, because for me that really is the key of how you get the horse out in front of the cart. You focus on the learning, and you focus on the educational aim of what you're trying to achieve, and take the technology along with you and put it to work in service of that priority for learning. There's a bunch of acknowledgements there. Oh, okay, so I'd expected a link to be there, which was the link to the slides. It's not. I'll certainly provide the slides afterwards for people who are interested. So just drop me an email, and it was tweeted earlier this morning, so you can pick it up from Twitter. If you do that, a bunch of other resources there as well. I'll stop there. Happy to take any questions you might have.